That was the moment the US stock market opened on Thursday morning, and it was downhill from there as investors, companies and governments reacted to Donald Trump's new global tariffs. Luckily, I was joined in the studio by two of the BBC's biggest economic brains to interpret what's been going on, and you can hear what they had to say on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
Hello, it's Dharshini in the Newscast studio.
And it's Ben in the Newscast studio.
Right, lots to get through then. First of all, just the confusion around what Trump has actually announced. I've also noticed that they've corrected some of the numbers he gave out himself in the big press conference in the Rose Garden yesterday. But Ben, you've been looking at the formula that the American boffins in the White House used to calculate which country is getting what tariff rates.
Yeah.
What have you found?
Well, we should lay the scene first of all. So everyone expected Trump, and this is what he said he would do. He would look at what the trade barriers were that they were imposing on imports from America into their countries, and he would match it. He said,
which includes tariffs and non-tariff.
Well, this is
things.
the key thing. So he said it's going to include things like value-added tax, which isn't a trade barrier, but leaving that aside, we all thought he was going to factor that in, and it would be things like licensing and other ways of which other countries might keep US goods out. So he unveiled that table in the Rose Garden, and we were all looking at these numbers thinking they don't really make any sense. How's he got to 39% for the EU and 67% for China and 90% for Cambodia? Because that's not reflected in their VAT or their normal tariffs or anything else. So we looked at it, the White House actually released, as you said, this formula which they've used. And the reality is it's got nothing to do with reciprocity at all, really. This formula, to cut a long story short, is designed to, in the White House's calculation, to over time reduce the bilateral trade deficit between the US and each individual country over time to zero. So it thinks if it puts tariff barriers up by the numbers it's chosen over time, the trade will be balanced between them and there will no longer be a trade deficit, which isn't about matching what they're doing. It's basically saying we don't want to sell you more than, and you to sell us any more than we sell you. So that's what the formula is. But there's a wrinkle in this, in that the UK, as we've discussed, runs, according to US data at least, a trade surplus with the UK, and yet we're getting a 10% tariff as well. So I think what that really underscores is that this isn't about tit for tat. It's about America wanting to get rid of its trade deficit with all countries and also do some of those other things which Donald Trump wants to achieve with tariffs, maybe raise more revenue for the US government to spend on tax cuts, or to encourage multinational manufacturers to set up shop in the UK, in the US, to avoid those tariffs. So it's really about those things rather than trade fairness as we would understand it.
I mean, Donald Trump has basically said those are his objectives, though. So it's not like this formula reveals some secret plan that he's got that we didn't know about.
Well, that's true, but it really threw us because they'd briefed quite heavily that it was going to be designed on this basis. So we were kind of reverse engineering how they got to these figures, and the reveal in this quite complex formula that they released overnight, and people worked it out what is actually going on.
And we can read your analysis on BBC Verify about what all the bits of the formula actually mean. Yeah, Dharshini.
Oh, I was just going to say we should have had the formula up on this lovely newscast.
Oh, yeah, we can
screen.
do graphics
You
now.
can do graphics. Come on. We've had hours to do this. Just to say, I mean, because sometimes it takes a while for these numbers to catch up with reality, right? In actual fact, the markets are now down by 3% in the US. So
it's just quite a lot.
It's
one minute of one day.
It really is. And, just to give you one little taster, Apple shares down by 8.5%. So that gives you
that's billions of dollars because that's such a wealthy company.
255 billion since you asked.
Wow.
Which is quite extraordinary.
And that's basically in the last 10 minutes, isn't it?
That is in the last 10 minutes. And if you look at where the stock markets there are at the moment, we're talking about a couple of $1 trillion notionally being wiped off the value of shares, right? And when you hear President Trump talking about potential gains, and look at this, obviously, wow.
So not to turn it into like A-level economics, but just explain the steps that mean Apple's share price has been hit that much by the announcement in the White House last night. What's actually happened there?
Yeah, well, you saw him and his, what are we calling it? Is it the horse race card or the
Everyone's
game
got a
show?
different, it's really revealing what people go for. Like Chris Mason went straight for horse racing. I was like, oh, betting man.
I said Eurovision.
Europe. Yes, it's very revealing of what people are into. It reminded me of just doing lots of gags on the Daily Politics where I'd carry around big cardboard boards of things. But anyway, so just sort of take us through the steps that mean Apple is now worth a lot less today.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, isn't it? When you look at some of those countries on that board there and the biggest losers, and as Ben was saying, there is that formula which came to light that, we now understand why it is those specific numbers came into place. Some of the big losers were the likes of Vietnam, Cambodia, Taiwan, the source of a lot of these components for gadgets, right? And a lot of things are made over there and shipped over. And guess what? Those are the kind of companies that you are going to see penalised as a result of these tariffs. Those goods are likely to get more expensive. Therefore, American consumers have to pay more or turn their backs on them and buy something else instead. So it's bad news for Apple. Gap, for example, that too sources a lot of clothing from the likes of Bangladesh. Nike or Nike? We've had a bit of a dispute about which one you call it.
Nike.
Thank you. I was told it's a generational thing. I'm not going to go into that anymore, except to say that they have almost 500,000 workers in Vietnam working in factories there. So you can see where their shares were penalised quite so badly. Ironically, these are some of the countries that increased their market share in the US under President Trump's first term because he was penalising China. So they managed to bump up at their share there and get more of the gains. But now it's payback time. And therefore, you're feeling it in that sort of that ring of multinationals.
And I suppose, Ben, for a big company like Apple, it's not like they can just build a whole load of new factories in the United States like Donald Trump would like them to do kind of today, next week, next month, probably even the next year. Yeah. These are supply chains that have been built up over decades.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things which it seems that Donald Trump doesn't really understand, the nature of global supply chains, global value chains. This is the nature of the economy we have had for decades now, which is not where individual countries produce things and then sell them to other countries. It's where multinational companies have their suppliers right across the globe, and their parts and products are crisscrossing national borders at a mind-bending rate and frequency. And if you throw sand in the wheels of that incredibly intricate and complex machine, which is what these tariffs will effectively do, every part that crosses a border, every product that crosses a border will now be tariffed according to these proposals from Donald Trump. That's really going to hit the profits of these multinational companies, which make up the bulk of the American stock market. And traders will say, well, they're going to be worth less for us to hold because they're going to make lower profits in future. That's the mechanism.
And newscaster Kalpana in Edinburgh says, do you think these companies will actually move back to the US?
No. Well, there's an interesting...
That was very decisive.
No. Well, yes and no. There are some, as Ben is saying, it's far more complicated than just going, let's just pick up and move over there. And it's very complicated when you have those intricate supply chains and you making a smartphone, you have hundreds, thousands of components and you have to fill in the paperwork and work out what tariff applies. But let's just go back in time slightly, because under President Trump's first term, he put tariffs on imported washing machines because American producers complained about that. And they complained in particular about South Korean manufacturers. Now, some of them did set up shop in the US and they did build some washing machines there. But they created, I think, a couple of thousand jobs, right? And if you look at the amount raised in tariffs and washing machines, the equivalent cost per job created was something like $800,000. So that just goes to show that it's a really expensive way of bumping up your production and, frankly, isn't that successful.
In terms of what Donald Trump is trying to achieve here, though, I mean, Ben, you said, he doesn't understand global value chains. But what if he does and actually he thinks all this pain, maybe even 2, 3, 4 years of pain is worth it because it will reorientate the US and world economy? Well,
it is interesting how his rhetoric has shifted, isn't it, in recent weeks, because he started out saying tariffs are the most beautiful word in the dictionary. It's going to create a new golden era. It'll all be win-win. They need us more than we need them. It will be utterly painless. That was his message to the American people when he was on the campaign trail and indeed when he entered the White House. More recently, he has started to say there may be a period of disruption. People in his administration have been talking about some of the sacrifices that need to be made. Whether that's the penny dropping about the reality of the impact of these tariffs, or whether they knew that all along, but they wanted to get people on side for it and prepare the ground for it, first of all, it's really hard to say. I think what is going to hit home to the American people, though, is the impact of all this, I think, relatively soon. I think, when American importers start to pay these tariffs, all the evidence of the Donald Trump's first term, when he imposed not tariffs on the scale of this, anything like it, but he did impose tariffs, that they were passed on to American consumers over time. So if he's doing it on a large scale, you have to expect this to be passed on to American consumers. They will feel it. And all the surveys of American consumers show that they do, despite what he's been saying, they do expect to be hit in the pocket by these tariffs. And that will have quite profound effects on people's sentiment and, I suspect, maybe even his popularity.
And the old Donald Trump really cared about the value of the American stock market. The new Donald Trump seems to care a bit less about that. And as you said, is willing to accept a bit more turbulence. But Americans are much more exposed to their stock market than British people are, aren't they? Just because of how they fund their retirement and these things called 401ks, which is their retirement funds that are all invested in stocks. And so maybe the American voter is a bit more sensitive to the S&P 500 than the average British voter is to the FTSE 100.
Yeah, well, I think you make a good point because, the Donald Trump spokesperson has been saying it's about Main Street, it's not about Wall Street. But, you're absolutely right. Americans are more attuned to the stock market, rightly or wrongly, whether it's a good thing or not, than they are in many other countries because of the way they save and the way they can see what's happening to their 401k accounts. So, we'll see whether those drops in their wealth, which they can see happening right now as we speak on a quite dramatic basis, change their opinions.
Dharshini, in terms of what other countries are saying and doing, what sort of categories of response have there been?
Oh, categories of response. We've had the keep your fingers crossed and hope for the best. Keep your head down. And we've heard the Commerce Secretary saying already, if you retaliate, then we are going to, ramp things up. You've got the likes of the UK, of course, saying we are crossing our fingers and hoping we can get this economic deal over the line, the economic accord, whatever you want to call it. But on the other hand, we are consulting with businesses and thinking about what we could do. And that rhetoric has been dialed up slightly.
Oh, yeah, that was a development. So basically, Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, was doing this statement in Parliament at lunchtime today. And yeah, that was the plot twist, wasn't it?
It was a sit up and listen moment.
Yeah, something they'd never said before, which is basically going to start this process of consulting with business to say, if we were to retaliate against these US tariffs, which particular areas would we want to focus on? So yeah, that is, as you said, a dialing up of the rhetoric from the UK.
Yeah, no, absolutely. From the UK point of view. And then you've got the EU saying, well, actually, we are already looking at ways if this doesn't work out, if negotiations don't work out. We've already got one raft of retaliatory measures because of steel tariffs. We're looking at the next raft now. So that is very much in train. And then you've got what's happening in China, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got those, frankly, who are a bit stunned at the moment and going, hang on, how did this all come about? And a lot of those, quite honestly, are poorer countries who did not expect to be in this position at all. And you can see there's a little bit of, hesitation about what do we do to make sure we don't get penalised even further.
And yeah, Ben, what have the White House said about the fact that, Myanmar, which has just had a massive earthquake, has got now a massive load of tariffs on it. Lesotho, a bit of southern Africa that is not very wealthy, got massive developmental challenges. Now they've got loads of tariffs on them from America, even though they're presumably no threat economically whatsoever to Washington. Have they said anything about it?
Well, I've not seen anything specific that they've said about that. But look, the reality is America has tariffed the entire world. All its trading partners are getting at least 10%, including some uninhabited islands in the Antarctic. So, look, there's so many countries which you can say, why are you doing this to them? Why are you doing that to the others? But America isn't just in this position at the moment where it's saying, look, we're going to completely, as they would put it, rebalance global trade, reset our relations with the rest of the world. Rich and poor, friend and foe. That was the rhetoric that Donald Trump was using last night. I think if they were to be asked about that, they would say, look, the rest of the world is just going to have to deal with it. America is changing the way it relates to the rest of the global economy.
I'm going to say something really weird now, which will seem just so strange in the context of this, but it really reminds me of when the coalition government came in and cancelled that big school rebuilding program, Building Schools for the Future. And I'm not comparing a giant reordering of global trade with cancelling school building projects, even though it would have felt just as big to you if it was your school that got cancelled. But it's an example of bureaucracies trying to do one big thing all at once means that there's lots of bumps in the road and wrinkles in the spreadsheet and corrections that have to be made, because basically the government in the UK had to correct that list that they put out. And it's just an example of why like doing one big thing all at once comes with consequences.
It comes with consequences or penguins.
Yeah, or mistakes, or things you have to clear up, or things. Yeah, so just explain to me the penguins thing.
The penguins.
So what's this territory called?
Well, if you would let us put that formula on the board, the answer would be penguins.
Yes, the Heard and McDonald Island.
The unheard of before Heard.
Yeah, the unheard of Heard Islands.
This is an island which, if you apply the formula in all its might, you come up with the answer. It should be tariffed quite heavily. But there's no humans on this island. There are only penguins. And all they're doing is smiling and waving. So, frankly, it's just one example of why the spreadsheet does not make sense.
And also things like French territories, which are actually part of France. They're not.
Yes.
They're not kind of separate economic territories. They've been included as if.
But they've also got Diego Garcia on the list of tariff entities, and the only inhabitants of that are inhabitants of the American naval base there. So they're effectively tariffing their own territory, which just goes to say, I mean, look, the big picture here is that they rushed through this whole process. It was calculated that if they were going to do genuine reciprocal tariffs, they would have to do a huge exercise of working out exactly what the trade barriers were. And if they were going to do it by item, that would have stretched to 2.6 million individual items. So there was no way they could ever do either of those exercises in honesty by yesterday. So what they've done, they've said they've short-circuited it. Also, we're going to come up with this crazy formula,
Rule of thumb.
And we're just going to do it on that and let everyone deal with the consequences, even the penguins.
And it's going to be hard enough to implement that, right, in a few days' time. Try and get all those extra tariffs in. It's complicated enough doing overseas trade, and yet you have to deal with that too.
Well, yeah, because if you think about it, any negotiation over a free trade agreement takes years, because you are negotiating over those individual things, whether it's beef or lamb or semiconductors. Yeah, so you can see why they've gone for a sort of big bang thing.
I'm glad you mentioned beef and lamb, and not that because it's, just past lunchtime.
She's not had lunch yet.
But did you notice that President Trump yesterday, because I know you're very alive to these things from your days in Brussels, etc., did mention the issue of chicken. He did mention the issue of beef and American products in that area, and his grievance against the EU and against Australia for not wanting to buy these things. And it does make you wonder, if they're having these ongoing talks here with the UK, are food standards creeping back into those conversations once again? And it's not formally on the table, but you've got to wonder.
Well, yeah, because every American administration, Democrat, Republican, Trumpian, completely establishment, has wanted to export their beef and chicken to the UK and the EU, and they've never managed to get round the food standards in those places because voters have never wanted to lower the food standards enough. But actually, the world's changed now, and so if the economic pressure is now so great, well, then maybe as a country we will start to accept these things.
But I think this is going to be a key point when it comes to the retaliation question, because America is an agricultural superpower. It creates a huge amount of produce, which it sends to a lot of countries, a lot to China. And China has already said we're going to bring back the tariffs on soybeans, which it imports a lot of from the US. So I wonder whether other countries are going to say there's a real vulnerability for American exporters here. If we tariff their agricultural exports, is that going to put political pressure on those Republican-leaning states which produce a lot of that agriculture? And was that the way to get Donald Trump to try to get Donald Trump to back off some of this or reverse some of it? I think that's a really interesting one to watch.
Well, yeah, and Donald Trump is quite sensitive to soybeans, because I remember back in my Brussels days when Jean-Claude Juncker, then the president of the Commission, went to Washington for a big kind of high-stakes showdown, and he came back and basically he'd offered to just buy bazillions of tons of soybeans, and that had kind of satisfied President Trump, and he kind of backed down a bit. Yeah, I mean, absolutely fascinating. One thing that's not on the list of countries, well, there's a few places that are not on there. Russia. Do we know what's going on there? Is it just that Russia's got the 10%, which is being applied to everyone, so it's just not on there because it's not getting an exceptional level of tariffs? Do we know?
I mean, the White House has been asked about this, and I think their answer has been that Russia is so heavily sanctioned and does so little trade with the US at the moment that it's kind of it's not worth putting it on there. I'm not sure how satisfactory that is, because places like Iran are on it, and where the same would apply. So I think it's a little bit of a mystery at the moment why it's not on there. But this list wasn't complete. It doesn't have Canada and Mexico on it, which are huge American trading partners, as we know. And then there was a little line saying, well, they're still going to be subject to the 25% tariffs linked to fentanyl, but if that falls away, they'll get a 12% tariffs. But it wasn't clear why that wasn't on the list. It just felt very rushed, in all honesty. And maybe they just fell off because they didn't print enough.
They didn't have a big enough piece of cardboard for Trump to hold up.
Could be.
So just to sort of rewind a bit back to the UK, I mean, on Tuesday night, there was a sort of vibe of like few coming from Whitehall and government departments that the UK, air quotes, only got the tariff of 10%, like the lowest it could be. I feel once people slept on that and woke up, it was a bit less few, or it was a fake few.
Fake few, or little less vibey.
Yeah.
No, there's definitely a sense of that, although there's been a few more sort of fews during the day, because it's become apparent, for example, as it stands, pharmaceuticals are not going to be subject to this tariff. So that's a huge sigh of relief for that particular industry for the moment, because there's a slight worry in the back of people's minds that maybe the Americans are gearing up to do something more spectacular, more punitive towards that particular industry, right? But at the same time, as you say, there has been that growing realisation today that 10% is still 10% quite a headache. And how do you deal with that, and how do you not jeopardise that?
And also, when your biggest trading partner, your neighbour, the EU, is facing double those tariffs, which is going to have an economic impact on the amount that they want to buy from you, then, you get all these spillover effects.
Yeah, I mean, on the other point on the 10%, it depends what your baseline of expectation is, of course. If you think, well, we were going to be treated like the EU and we've got 10%, then it looks good. It looks positive. We've got a let-off. If you think, well, we have a special relationship with America and Starmer had that trip to see Trump and it was all very convivial. So maybe if any nation was going to get an exception from the 10%, maybe that should have been the UK, and that wasn't delivered. So it depends where you're coming at it from, what you think is a reasonable thing for the UK to aim for.
Right, we've covered a lot of ground there. I didn't want to be rude and get my phone out and look at my apps I look at to see what's happening with shares and things. But I just wonder if, when I do look at it, if the dip is going to start to look a bit like the dip we got in March 2020 when COVID hit and everyone thought this is going to be bad for the world economy. And you can just see, like, that'll be in the history. That is visible to see forever now on the historic graphs of what happened to share prices and various stock indexes and the global economy. I just wonder if the last 24 hours, like the time we've been speaking now, is now just going to be visible on that chart for the rest of time now because it's so huge.
Yeah, well, stock market's all about expectations. They're future-looking, they're forward-looking. So the issue with the reaction today is that this was bigger than they expected going into it, because they had been going down. We shouldn't forget that the stock markets are already about 10%, just under, down from where they were about a month ago. And that was because it became clear Donald Trump was going to follow through on what he said on tariffs. And in the end, it was even bigger than they thought. So they went down. So what they will do next depends on what they think he's going to do next, what the retaliation will be, whether he will respond to the retaliation himself. Maybe the hit won't be as bad because they have exceptions to some of these tariffs. So it all depends on the news flow.
So the line might get quite wiggly as opposed to just down. To use a technical term. Look at me talking to the two economists. And Dharshini, though, that takes us back to your original point right at the start of this conversation about the Apple share price. Because that isn't just about what's happened to Apple's supply chain in China and Vietnam. It's also an expectation of how wealthy Americans are going to be in the next year or so, whether they can buy a new iPhone or a new iPad, because they might be in a recession as a result of this.
They could well be. I mean, I saw one forecast when I came up here which said, if we just stay where we are, what's on the table? Don't forget about retaliation. We could be looking at a halving of growth in America this year. I mean, not quite recession territory yet, but we could be edging towards it. And Americans are still the biggest shoppers on the planet. And if we get to that stage where tariffs are punitive and they are paying higher prices of things, it's not just those particular items, it's others too. So you're going to see a more broad-based drop in the stock market, right? But, a lot of what we're talking about is speculation, stock markets, and we can't forget that. And at the moment, there is a huge information uncertainty void still. And this is like a very intricate dance, and we've heard that first step from the president. We don't know where it leads to. We don't know what other governments are going to do. We don't know what businesses are going to do. We don't know how consumers are going to react. So we may in a few years' time be going, oh my goodness, it was another COVID. Or actually, it could look quite different.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. As somebody who spent much of their journalistic life covering politics and now kind of zooming out to cover a lot more stuff, you do latch on to things like the stock market because it feels like the truth or it feels like a fact. But actually, it's not. It's just a cumulative kind of guesswork of everyone who's trading that day. And so it might be right, it might be wrong. It's based a bit on what's going to happen. It's also based on a lot of sentiment. So I can see why people who aren't in this world think, oh, why do you obsess about it so much?
It's a vibe.
As you just said, it's not necessarily the real thing. Having said that, though, what's your app saying now, Ben, as we finish recording this episode of Newscast at 3 p.m. on Thursday?
The app is saying that US stocks tumble at the open after tariff onslaught. So a real thumbs down from the American stock market, at least at the opening. Who knows where we end up by the end of today? We've been through enough cycles to
We
know.
have, just in the last 5 years, COVID onwards.
Yeah, which is what uncertainty in the global economy is. That's it playing out. Ben, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
Dharshini, thanks to you too.
Adam, thank you.
And thanks to you for listening to this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.